The last normal sound I remember was the ticking of the kitchen clock. It was just past 4 in the afternoon, right when Emily and Laura were supposed to walk through the front door. I had chicken thawing in the sink and the windows open to let in the warm March breeze. But the house was too quiet. No door slamming, no voices calling out. Just the slow, even tick of that clock and something hollow starting to press in on my chest. I knew then, before the calls, before the police, something had gone wrong. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your own street, your own life. Every click helps pull another name back into the light. My name is Linda Marsh. I'm 51 now, and I've lived in Kensington, Maryland most of my life. Back in '75, we had a blue shuttered house on Plier Mill Road, quiet neighborhood, tight front lawn, flower boxes I changed out by season. My husband, Robert, was known all over D.C. from his radio show on WMAK-AM. But at home, he was just Dad still in his socks by the time the dinner bell rang. We had 4 kids, stair-stepped in age. Jacob was 15, full of that teenage tilt between independence and responsibility. He loved basketball and didn't mind dragging his little brother Matthew along to the courts if it meant peace from chores. But it was the girls who anchored the home. Emily was 12 and starting to keep a journal. Laura was 10 quick with a joke and loud in the best way. They shared a room, a dresser, and that strange blend of childhood closeness and early teenage mood swings. That spring felt almost too perfect. Their birthdays were close. Emily would be 13, Laura 11, and the girls had been buzzing about Wheaton Plaza for weeks. They loved watching the department store switch from winter coats to Easter dresses. The carousel of window displays, the smell of warm pizza from the Orange Bowl diner just off the main strip. On March 25th, it was a Tuesday, spring break. The house stirred slow that morning, no alarms, no packed lunches. The boys were headed out to the courts by 11, and the girls had their own plan. They asked if they could walk to Wheaton Plaza, get a slice, maybe look around. I gave them each $2 enough for lunch and a treat if they wanted. I remember telling them, "Be back by 4." Emily nodded. Laura was already halfway out the door. It was 65 degrees that day. Sunlight softened the sidewalks. I watched from the window as they disappeared down the street, 2 girls in windbreakers side by side, their hair bouncing as they walked. By noon, the house had emptied. I did laundry, folded shirts, switched the radio to Robert's station just to hear his voice fill the kitchen. Normal things. By 3:30, I had the table set. The smell of fried chicken would bring them running. It always had. But 4 o'clock came and went, then 4:15, then 4:30, and the door never opened. I didn't hear the door open, but I still looked up. At that point, I must have checked the window 5 or 6 times in under 10 minutes. The house was still and too quiet, and I kept wiping my hands on a towel that didn't need folding. The smell of dinner was starting to fade, and even Matthew's usual stomping around was absent. By 5:15, I had moved from waiting to watching. The kind of stillness that creeps in after a missed appointment had settled into my chest. I stood by the front screen, holding it open like maybe that would make them come faster. The girls weren't late without reason. Emily took rules seriously. Laura, for all her chatter and jokes, didn't push boundaries. 4 o'clock meant 4 o'clock. I tried not to worry out loud in front of the boys. But Robert could see it on me as soon as he walked through the door. His work bag was still in his hand when I told him they hadn't come home. He looked down at his watch, then back at me. Didn't say anything at first, just walked past me into the den and picked up the phone. The officer who answered our call was polite, calm. He said missing children weren't uncommon, especially during school breaks. Maybe they'd run into friends or lost track of time. He told us he'd send someone by. I remember nodding like that was enough, like hearing the phrase lost track of time would loosen the grip I felt around my ribs. But I knew better. Emily wouldn't lose track of time. Laura might dawdle, but her sister would have pulled her back. And both of them knew dinner would be ready by 5. Fried chicken was Laura's favorite. The sun had started dropping low behind the houses when the cruiser pulled into our driveway. An officer stepped out and introduced himself, asked us to walk him through the day. I gave every detail I could remember: what they were wearing, what time they left, what money I gave them, the pizza parlor they planned to visit. Robert stood behind me the whole time with his arms folded tight, listening to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. We both knew the moment had shifted. This wasn't just a delay anymore. By nightfall, the search had begun in earnest. Patrol cars circled the neighborhood. Officers knocked on doors. Neighbors turned on porch lights and came outside with their jackets zipped halfway and worry already on their faces. Someone passed out flyers with Emily and Laura's descriptions. We kept the phone line clear, taking shifts by the receiver, in case the girls called. In case anyone called. That first night dragged slow. I didn't sleep, not really. I lay on the couch with my eyes open, listening for footsteps on the porch, a voice calling out. Morning brought nothing. By the next day, the search spread beyond our street. Officers checked every lot, every alley, every bus stop between Wheaton Plaza and our home. They brought in dogs, trained ones. One of the officers told me they picked up a scent near the plaza. It followed through the sidewalk corridor behind the department store, then out into the parking lot. After that, it just stopped. No trail, no confusion, no sign of panic. Just gone. Like the scent had dropped off a cliff. Flyers went up in grocery stores, gas stations, and church bulletin boards. A few blocks over, I saw a flyer taped to the window of a bakery we used to visit when the kids were younger. Their faces were everywhere now, in full color, smiling wide, and with every passing hour the smiles felt harder to look at. They weren't lost. That's what I kept thinking. People get lost. But my daughters had vanished. Witnesses began to come forward, each one adding a small fragment that didn't quite connect. A neighborhood boy said he'd seen them sitting on a bench outside the Orange Bowl talking to a man in a brown suit. Said he had a briefcase and a microphone, told the girls he was recording voices for the radio. That stuck with me. Robert had spent years in broadcasting. Emily and Laura would have seen him with studio gear before. To them, it wouldn't have felt unusual. It might have even felt familiar. The boy said the man was tall, clean-cut, walked with a slight limp. Not someone who looked threatening, just someone who knew how to speak with kids without raising alarms. Another girl came forward. Said she'd noticed a younger man at the plaza, too much scruffier, acne-scarred, late teens maybe. He was following groups of kids around, watching them too closely. She said it wasn't a glance, it was a stare. He didn't smile, didn't look away when caught, just followed. She remembered telling him off with a joke. He didn't flinch. That same man, she said, had also been watching my daughters. Her voice caught when she said it. I don't blame her. That kind of detail doesn't let go easily. At around 2:30 that afternoon, a friend of ours said he saw the girls walking west away from the plaza. Heading home. They weren't running. They didn't look scared. Just two sisters walking together, chatting, bags in hand. That was the last time anyone we know saw them. That moment, ordinary, unremarkable, would become the final piece of certainty we had. After that, every lead turned murky. The next 10 days felt endless. Phones rang, tips came in. People said they'd seen girls in the back seat of a white car or being pulled across a parking lot. Someone claimed they spotted them in Virginia. Police followed every tip. Some of them seemed promising. None of them led anywhere. Then came the call. April 4th, 10 days after they vanished. The phone rang mid-afternoon. Robert answered first, then passed it to me. The voice was strange, disguised, like it was filtered through something. The man on the other end said he had the girls. Said he wanted $10,000. He gave instructions, exact ones. Said to leave the money in a restroom at the Annapolis courthouse in a briefcase. He warned against police, told us if we wanted them back, we'd follow his directions exactly. The officers were already monitoring our line. They told us not to panic, said they had a plan. The money we were supposed to leave, it wasn't real. Just $11 arranged to look like more. A decoy. They watched the drop site for hours, waiting for someone to appear. No one did. But the phone rang again. The voice came back, this time angrier. He said he saw the cops, said the deal was off. Then he hung up. That silence on the line. It never ended. The phone never rang again. Not from him. Not from anyone who could tell us where they were. We told them we needed to hear the girls. Needed proof they were alive. But the voice never came back. No ransom, no names. Just silence. And in that silence, something deeper started to take root. It was no longer a search. It was something else, something darker. What broke me wasn't the sound of that man's voice. It was what he didn't say. And it was what came next from someone no one expected that began to shift everything again. A teenager, a red car, and a story we almost didn't believe. They said most of these calls don't lead anywhere. That was the phrase one of the detectives used. We were sitting at the kitchen table when he said it, paperwork spread between us like some kind of shield. And I remember looking down at the legal pad in front of me as if it might offer a better answer. The man on the phone, the one who demanded the ransom, never called again. And just like that, the one thread we thought we had snapped without resistance. But they kept at it. Police followed tips, reran statements, knocked on doors we'd already tried. Friends brought casseroles we didn't touch. Church members sent prayers and cards I opened but couldn't read. The outside world didn't stop. It just moved a little more slowly around us. There was a boy, 11 years old, who came forward early April. William Kessler. His family lived out near the Virginia line. He said he'd seen a white Pontiac on Route 211 sometime after the girls had vanished. Inside, he swore, were two girls that looked like Emily and Laura. One of them was crying. The driver was a man he didn't recognize. That alone might have been chalked up to mistaken identity, but the direction of travel made sense. Route 211 would have been a straight run west from Wheaton Plaza. The officers checked the timing ran. The route started looking into Pontiacs registered in the state. No match. Nothing solid, but they logged it, just like everything else. The next day brought something harder to dismiss. A woman in Manassas called it in. She'd seen a beige Ford station wagon Maryland plates with two girls in the back seat. She said they were bound, gagged. She didn't just report what she saw. She followed the car. Memorized part of the plate. DMT6. Said the driver noticed her and ran a red light trying to get away. That got the detectives' attention. They pulled registration records from Cumberland to Baltimore, ran hundreds of possible plate variations. Still nothing that tied back to us. No trace of the girls. No known suspects with that make or model. The witness stood by what she saw, but without the full plate or a solid visual ID. It stayed marked as credible unconfirmed. That month blurred at the edges. Officers expanded their radius. National Guardsmen joined the search by May, combing the woods of Montgomery County on foot. Not volunteers, military personnel. They knew what they were doing, used metal detectors, checked ravines and tree lines. They didn't find anything. No clothing, no bodies, no disturbed soil. Not even a misplaced shoe. It was like someone had plucked the girls out of the frame and left the background untouched. Then, on April 1st, just 1 week after the girls went missing, a name came into the file that I wouldn't hear for almost 40 years. An 18-year-old named Lloyd Welch called the police, said he'd seen something, claimed to have witnessed a man forcing 2 girls into a red Camaro in the parking lot at Wheaton Plaza, said the girls didn't want to go, that they struggled. The man had a briefcase, a microphone, a limp. That part matched. It was enough to warrant a sit-down. They brought Welch in, asked him to take a polygraph. He agreed, failed it completely. Not borderline, not inconclusive. The technician marked him as deceptive across the board. The assumption was he made the story up for reward money. We'd put up $9,000 by then, almost everything we had. Police dismissed him, labeled his statement unreliable. One of hundreds of tips that fizzled before it ever caught flame. But there was something else, a detail that didn't sit right with the detective on duty that night. Welch didn't seem rattled by the polygraph results. He didn't get angry, didn't withdraw. He just went quiet, like he already knew how this would go. They wrote up the report, filed it under a single page, and moved on to the next name. Welch wasn't mentioned again. Not in our conversations. Not in any summary I was ever shown. At the time, none of us thought twice about it. But that name, his name would surface again. Much later. The media had started to shift by then. We went from top story to background noise in under 6 weeks. New crimes took over headlines. Missing persons with fresher timelines. We stayed on the bulletin boards, but the urgency drained out of the case like rain soaking into dirt. Still, the calls didn't stop. Some were sincere. Some were cruel. There were people who claimed to have seen the girls in Oklahoma, Georgia, even Canada. Some described Emily's freckles down to the spot. One woman mailed us a postcard that simply read, "They're alive. Don't give up. No return address. No way to track it." Just that. A few names did stand out over time. One was Fred Coffey, a convicted offender who'd been in the area back in '75. He'd used cameras and other props to lure kids similar to what that boy described at the plaza. He had a record, a pattern, and no alibi for the week following the girl's disappearance. The detectives thought he might be the tape recorder man, but they couldn't place him at the mall that day. No one saw him with Emily or Laura, and Coffey never confessed. Eventually, the case against him thinned out. Like everything else, it faded from priority. We started seeing less of the same officers. Some were transferred, others retired. A few stopped coming by altogether. By the time we reached the end of summer, even our neighbors had gone back to normal. The bikes were out again. Sidewalk chalk drawings reappeared. Life made room for itself whether we wanted it to or not. Our house stayed quiet. Laura's bed still had her hairbrush on the quilt. Emily's journal sat closed beside her pillow. Their drawers were still full. We couldn't bring ourselves to touch anything. I started walking in the mornings, just far enough to tire myself out. It helped me fall asleep at night, but not for long. Robert kept working. His voice stayed calm behind the microphone. But at home, he barely spoke above a whisper. The boys coped in their own ways. Jacob got quieter. Matthew had night terrors for months. And through all of it, no one not once came forward with real proof. Not a photo, not a note, not a single item belonging to the girls. Only that growing file at the station. And one name, buried under paperwork, with a failed polygraph, a dismissed statement, and a story we should have listened to. Even if it didn't make sense at the time. Even if it came from a boy with a history no one wanted to look into. Because years later, long after the flyers were gone and the beds were boxed up, that same name would surface. Not as a witness, but as something else entirely. By the fall of that same year, I'd stopped expecting answers. I didn't stop hoping. I don't think a parent ever does. But I stopped looking for logic. Nothing about what had happened to Emily and Laura made sense, and no one, not the detectives, not the neighbors, not the flyers that still curled under stapled telephone poles, could offer anything resembling resolution. I started waking before the sun, not because I had anything to do, but because it was the only hour that felt blank. No news, no waiting, just quiet. Some days I stood on the porch before Robert was even dressed for work. I would stare out toward the empty sidewalk, toward the turn at the end of Pliers Mill Road, as if by standing still long enough, I could will them to appear around the bend, backpacks bouncing their voices, arguing about nothing at all. But they never did. The boys adjusted in ways I didn't always see coming. Jacob kept to himself, more practiced his basketball shot late into the night sometimes, until the neighbors knocked on our door. Matthew started asking questions about death, about what it felt like to disappear. We did our best to answer them gently, but the truth was, we didn't know any more than he did. We'd run out of useful words. In the months after the case went cold, the phone rang less. The investigators stopped coming by. The officers who had walked through our kitchen with muddy boots and quiet clipboards had either been reassigned or left the force altogether. The man who had taken Lloyd Welch's polygraph, who wrote his name down on that single piece of paper and marked lied, he'd retired before 1980. People moved on. The world did what it always does when it runs out of places to look it settled. But I couldn't. That fall, I began reading the case files that Robert had kept stacked in the cabinet behind his desk. He was careful not to let the boys see them. But I'd find myself leafing through them when the house was empty mostly at night. I didn't read them in order. I couldn't. Something about that made it feel final. Instead, I flipped until something caught my eye. A witness name, a street I recognized, a note scribbled in red pen. Sometimes I stopped on photos. Grainy surveillance from the plaza, blurry shapes that could have been anyone. Or maybe they weren't. One name I found again and again was Richard Allen Welch. I didn't know who he was at the time. Just that he was connected somehow to Lloyd, an uncle maybe, or cousin. Or the paperwork wasn't clear, and the investigators didn't seem to push further. I circled his name in pencil and moved on. I had no reason to think it mattered. Not then. Years went by like that. Birthdays passed. Holidays reshaped themselves. We kept the girls' room just the way it was. Friends said we should close it up, repaint, donate the clothes. We never did. Robert left his job at the station not long after the 10th anniversary. Said the sound of his own voice didn't sit right with him anymore. I went back to part-time work at the library downtown, something to keep my hands busy. But the weight didn't lift. It just changed shape. By the time the year 2000 came around, there were new officers on the force. People who hadn't even lived in Kensington in 1975 were now wearing the badge, carrying radios, patrolling the same streets our daughters had walked. I didn't expect any of them to remember the case, but once in a while someone would mention it quietly, like a question they weren't sure they should ask. "Was it your daughters?" And I would nod because what else was there to say? We got occasional updates from the department, usually short letters or phone calls that repeated what we already knew. Leads were still being reviewed. No new developments at this time. Your case remains open. I stopped answering those calls after a while. Robert took over. He could listen to silence better than I could. But then in 2013, we got a visit. Not a phone call, not a letter. A knock on the door. Sergeant Chris Hamrock introduced himself politely. Said he was from Montgomery County PD. Said he was reopening the cold file on Emily and Laura, and that he wanted to start from the beginning. I didn't say anything for a while, just stood in the doorway and listened. He looked young, maybe in his 40s. Not green, though. He didn't ask the usual questions. Didn't ask if we'd seen anything new. He asked about the old notes, the names. He asked if we remembered Lloyd Welch. I hadn't heard that name in years. Sergeant Hamrock explained that he'd been reviewing the original files and came across Welch's one-page statement from April 1975. He said what struck him wasn't the content, it was how easily it had been discarded. Just one polygraph, one quick judgment. But now that he was looking at it again, it didn't sit right. And when he pulled a 1977 mugshot of Lloyd Welch from a long archived database, something clicked. The resemblance to the composite sketch from that day at the plaza of the scruffy young man who followed girls around the food court, the one with the bad skin and vacant stare, it wasn't perfect. But it was close enough to ask questions. I invited the sergeant in. Robert came in from the back and shook his hand. We sat together in the den where the family photos still hung untouched. He laid out everything he had, Welch's record, his history with children, the states he'd lived in, the crimes he'd already been convicted of, and finally, the fact that Welch was serving time for an unrelated conviction at a facility in Delaware. That he wasn't free. That he couldn't hurt anyone now. But that wasn't the end of it. Sergeant Hamrock asked for our blessing to interview Welch in prison. He said they had reason to believe that after all this time, Welch might still remember something. That maybe now, with nothing left to gain, he might finally be ready to talk. I remember looking at Robert. He didn't speak, just gave a single nod. I said yes. Before the sergeant left, he paused at the door and said something I haven't forgotten. He said, "This time we're going to follow him to the end." And that's exactly what they did. Because 2 weeks later, in a prison interview room, more than 100 miles from our home, Lloyd Welch sat down across from detectives and said words none of us ever thought we'd hear. "I know why you're here," he told them. "You're here about those 2 missing girls." When Sergeant Hamrock came back from Delaware that fall, his tone had shifted. He didn't say it outright, But something had changed in the way he spoke, like he was trying not to get ahead of himself. The first interview with Lloyd Welch had lasted hours. And according to Hamrock, Welch hadn't just remembered the case, he'd been expecting the visit. He knew who they were, knew the girls' names, said he'd seen what happened. At first, Welch framed himself as a witness, not a participant. He claimed he'd been at Wheaton Plaza that day, March 25, 1975. Said he'd seen a man with a briefcase leading two girls toward a red Camaro. Said the girls didn't look scared, but that something about it didn't sit right with him. He told the detectives he hadn't said anything back then because he was afraid of the man, afraid of being blamed, afraid no one would believe him. And in a way, that last part turned out to be true. They hadn't believed him, not when he first called it in, not after the polygraph. But this time was different. Welch was older now, in his 60s. He was already serving a near-life sentence in Delaware for child abuse. He had nothing to bargain for and no reason to lie, at least not in any way that made sense to the officers interviewing him. But still, his story changed with every meeting. Over the next few months, the detectives interviewed Welch 12 more times, and with every new version of events, he moved himself a little closer to the center of the crime. At first, he said it was someone named Ray Raymond Molesky who had taken the girls. Welch said Ray had ties to child trafficking circles around D.C., and that he'd seen the girls taken to Ray's house drugged and eventually killed. It was graphic, and it was unverifiable. Molesky was dead by then, killed in prison after a conviction for shooting his wife and teenage son. The timeline didn't hold. The story started to fray under basic scrutiny. And when the detectives pushed Welch for details, street names, rooms in the house, what the basement looked like, he couldn't keep it straight. Eventually, Welch stopped pointing fingers and started admitting more. The man with the briefcase. That was never someone else. That had been Welch himself. He said the girls hadn't screamed. Said he'd approached them the same way he'd approached others, kind voice fake radio gear, a promise that their voices might go out over the air. They trusted him because their father worked in radio. They thought it was something familiar, something safe. He said he drove them away from the plaza himself, but even then, he wouldn't say where. Not yet. What he did admit was that he hadn't been alone. He started talking about his uncle Richard Allen Welch and about his father Lloyd Sr. Said they'd been waiting at a property outside Hyattsville, a house with a basement, concrete floors, a single padlocked entrance. He said they brought the girls there, that they were kept alive for at least a day, that there had been abuse, that he'd seen it, that he'd helped clean up. But when asked what happened next, he kept shifting. Sometimes he said he saw his uncle take the girls downstairs and never come back up with them. Sometimes he claimed to have seen the aftermath. Other times, he said he'd left before anything final happened. The stories were always close, but never exact. But there was one detail that didn't change the basement. Sergeant Hamrock and his team filed a search warrant for that Hyattsville property in September. By then, it had changed owners multiple times. But the layout hadn't changed. The basement matched Welch's description down to the single locked entry and the poured concrete floor. They used luminol to test for blood, not expecting much after nearly 4 decades. But under the coating of paint, the splatter patterns came through. On the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling. It wasn't just a few drops. It was everywhere. The DNA couldn't be matched to degraded, but it was human. And the volume of it spread as it was suggested violence, the kind that wasn't survived. Welch's confession changed again after that. He no longer claimed to have only witnessed what happened. Now he said he'd helped dispose of the bodies. Said they'd been placed in military-style duffel bags. Said he'd driven them out of state.
to a place called Taylor's Mountain in Bedford County, Virginia, a patch of land his family had owned for years. Said he'd burned the remains in a fire that lasted days, and when asked why he'd never spoken up before, he just stared at the table and said, "No one asked me the right way." The team drove to Taylor's Mountain in December. The ground was hard and frozen, but they searched anyway. A cousin of Welch's, Henry Parker, had lived on the land back then. And after some hesitation, he confirmed that Lloyd had shown up there in the spring of 1975, carrying 2 heavy bags that smelled like meat left out too long. Said Lloyd tossed them into the burn pit without explanation. Said the fire didn't go out for days. A second cousin, Connie Akers, also remembered that visit. Said Lloyd had come with his girlfriend. Said there'd been a green canvas bag with a terrible smell, that he'd asked her to help clean blood-stained clothes, that she'd refused, and when she pressed him on the smell, he said it was beef gone bad. But it wasn't. The investigators brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic archaeologists. They excavated the fire pit and surrounding woods over the course of several weeks. They found bone fragments, a tooth, bits of metal that could have been from eyeglass frames, some beaded plastic maybe from a bracelet or a hair tie. It wasn't enough to confirm identity. No fingerprints, no intact DNA. But it matched the timeline, the place, the confessions. After all those years, the ground had started to give back something. I remember when Sergeant Hamrock called. It was just past 6 p.m. and Robert had already gone to bed. I stepped outside with the cordless phone and stood under the porch light. He didn't tell me everything, not then. But he said, "Linda, I think we're getting close now. I think we found where they were taken." And for the first time in decades, I didn't ask him what he meant. I just said, "I know." Because after all the lies, the wrong turns the silence, we'd finally reached something solid. And whether or not it brought peace, I needed to see where this trail ended. Even if the truth was worse than I imagined. Even if some part of me already knew. Because what Welch described next wasn't just a place or a moment. It was the reason I'd never stop listening, no matter how late the call came. When the winter lifted and the snow began to thin along the ridgelines of Taylor's Mountain, the search crews returned. It was March by then, almost exactly 40 years since Emily and Laura walked to Wheaton Plaza, and the wind still bit through your coat that high up. I remember Sergeant Hamrock telling me they were going back out there with new ground-penetrating radar equipment. They were going to do one more pass, he said through a section of the property they hadn't fully cleared during the first dig. I didn't ask why it took so long to circle back. I already knew the answer. It takes time to build the kind of case that doesn't fall apart, and for as much as Welch had confessed his story kept shifting under pressure. One detail, though, had never changed the bags. He told them again and again, sometimes angry, sometimes low and detached, that he carried the bodies in 2 green canvas duffels, the kind with thick zippers and military straps. Said they were heavy. That one of them started leaking before he even got out of Maryland. That the smell stayed in his truck for days, maybe weeks even after the fire. It was the kind of statement the detectives didn't know what to do with at first. He offered it voluntarily, like it was fact. But there was no proof, no license plate that matched, no vehicle recovered. Just his words. Still, they went back to the mountain. The property had changed hands since 1975. But a few of the original structures were still standing barely. The old barn where Welch said he parked was sagging at the eaves, one corner collapsed inward from decades of weather. The fire pit he described was harder to locate. The original burn site, according to the cousins, had been covered over with gravel sometime in the late 80s. But once they peeled it back layer by layer, the char patterns were still there, blackened earth deep enough to register as thermal distortion on their radar. And then they started finding them again. More fragments. Bone. Tiny. Degraded. Scorched beyond recognition. The state forensic pathologist would later confirm some of them were human, too small to match an adult. But that was as far as they could go. The press didn't know any of this yet. Neither did the wider public. Welch hadn't been charged, not officially. And the department wasn't ready to speak. But behind the scenes, the case was moving. Slowly. And what emerged during those last few interviews with Welch was something colder than any of us had expected. When asked about the days after the abduction, Welch admitted to more. He said he'd stayed on the mountain while the fire burned. Said he'd been given orders to watch the pit, to keep the fire going, to make sure there was nothing left. He described waking up in a folding chair, smoke still thick in the air. The bags gone, the pit smoldering. He told detectives that his Uncle Richard brought him breakfast one of those mornings. Biscuits wrapped in foil. He said the two of them sat in silence, neither one mentioning what had been in the fire. That moment described in such plain terms was the first time I realized how deep this ran. Not just one man, not just Lloyd. There were others. The cousins began to speak too. Henry Parker, who'd stayed silent for decades, confirmed what Welch had said, recalled the smell, the green bags, the refusal to ask questions. Connie remembered it differently, less visual, more sensory. The sour chemical smoke, the tension around the adults, the way no one wanted to touch the laundry Welch had left behind. She didn't say it outright, but you could hear it in her voice. They all knew something had happened. They just didn't say it out loud. When the investigators cross-checked dates, they found something else. Richard Allen Welch Lloyd's uncle had been in the area when the girls disappeared. He had a record, too. Not as long as Lloyd's, but enough. Disorderly conduct. Assault. He'd been questioned in unrelated cases, but never charged. He'd lived near Hyattsville, just a few blocks from the property with the concrete basement. The same one where luminol lit the walls like a crime scene frozen in time. And when the detectives asked Lloyd again, point blank, who had hurt the girls, he paused. And then he said, Richard. Richard did. But even then, he wouldn't say everything. Wouldn't say who made the call to our house on April 4th. Wouldn't say who packed the bags. Wouldn't say whether they were dead when the fire started. There were gaps. Wide ones. And the closer the team got to the heart of it, the more Welch leaned on contradiction. One day, he'd admit to carrying the girls. The next, he'd say he was only told to do so. He'd describe the bags in perfect detail, then claim he couldn't remember how they got into his truck. That inconsistency made it hard for prosecutors. It's one thing to secure a confession. It's another to hold it up in court, especially without recovered remains. But the evidence was stacking. The concrete basement, the blood, the burn site, the beaded plastic, the eyeglass wire, the fire that never should have burned that long. I remember the day the Bedford County team called to ask for dental records. They said they couldn't confirm identification, not with what they'd found, but they needed everything: braces, pediatric x-rays, even notes from our old dentist.
I went into the hall closet where we kept the old files and found a folder labeled School Medical. The pages were yellowed, the edges curled from damp. But the records were there. I don't remember handing them over. Just the feeling in my legs as I stood in the doorway after the courier left my hand still on the knob. The records didn't lead to a breakthrough. The fragments were too damaged. But it didn't matter. By summer, the team had built enough to move forward. And though Welch still wouldn't say it in full, he'd said enough. Enough to link himself to the abduction. Enough to place himself at the scene. Enough to connect him to the fire. They told us in quiet, careful words. A grand jury would be convened. Charges were coming. Not for everyone involved, at least not yet, but for Lloyd Welch. 2 counts of first-degree murder. And in the months that followed, I began to understand what justice looked like this far from the crime. It wasn't full. It wasn't clean. But it was real. And it would have to be enough. Because the deeper they looked, the more they realized Lloyd hadn't acted alone. And not everyone they needed was still alive. The morning the indictment was announced, Robert stood by the sink holding the newspaper like he'd forgotten what he was supposed to do with it. The front page ran a small photo, grainy, outdated, of Lloyd Welch in a beige prison jumpsuit, eyes half-lidded, his name typed in block letters beneath the headline. The words were simple, man indicted in 1975, cold case. The rest of the details were buried further inside facts we already knew by heart. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors believed the killings occurred during the commission of sexual abuse. There would be no bail, and the case would be tried in Bedford County, Virginia. I didn't sit down when I read it. I stood beside the table and traced each sentence with the edge of my thumb, not because I didn't believe it, but because I'd lived with absence for so long that even something as firm as a charge felt unreal. But it was real. After 4 decades of silence, the law was finally speaking. The grand jury transcripts weren't made public at first, but Sergeant Hamrock called that afternoon. His voice didn't rise or drop when he told me the timeline. Lloyd Welch would be arraigned within the month. A preliminary hearing would follow. If all went forward without complication, the trial could begin as early as the next year. I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and thanked him for letting us know. He paused before he hung up and said something soft. There's still more we don't know, Linda. But this is a start. The hearing was set for early fall. The courthouse in Bedford County looked more like a small-town bank than a place that held people's lives in its walls. Pale brick white trim and a single metal detector at the front. Robert and I arrived before most others. We sat in the back row. There were no reporters in the room yet, just attorneys, a few quiet deputies, and Welch's public defender, who didn't look much older than Jacob had been when the girls went missing. I don't remember Welch entering, but I remember when he turned. The courtroom was silent, and for a brief second, his eyes met mine. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. But there was nothing behind them. No recognition. No shame, just vacancy. The judge read the charges. 2 counts of murder in the first degree. The prosecutor added that the deaths occurred in the course of child abuse and potentially the creation of illegal materials. Welch was asked to enter a plea. He said the word guilty flatly, like it had no weight. There was no emotion, no visible tension in his jaw or shoulders. He simply sat back down and stared straight ahead. The agreement had been worked out beforehand. 2 concurrent 48-year sentences. Given Welch's age,
he would die behind bars. There was a chance, remote statistical, that he could apply for parole sometime in his 80s. But no one in that room, not even his own attorney, believed he'd ever see the outside again. What haunted me most wasn't the sentence. It was the absence of detail. The plea agreement avoided a trial. That meant no cross-examination, no witness testimony, no sworn answers under oath. Welch never had to describe exactly what happened in that basement. Never had to say who made the decision, who held the girls down, who ended their lives. He admitted to helping transport them. He admitted they died. But the full truth, how long they lived after being taken, what they endured, remained sealed in the spaces between his words. When the hearing ended, the judge offered a brief statement. He acknowledged the length of time that had passed, the toll it had taken. He said he hoped the plea would bring some measure of closure to the families. And then he moved on to the next case. The next file. The next line on his calendar. After the room emptied, Robert and I stepped outside and stood under the overhang. The air smelled like wet pavement and pine sap. For a moment, I thought of Laura's strawberry shampoo, Emily's paperback stacked by the bed, the sound of their feet thudding against the hallway carpet as they raced to beat the 4 o'clock curfew. Those sounds had grown quiet in my memory, softened by time, but they hadn't vanished. And that day, standing in a courthouse hundreds of miles from home, they rushed back in like wind through an open door. I thought it would feel like something, closure maybe, or release. But what it felt like was final. Not full. Just final. Richard Allen Welch was never charged. The prosecutors said there wasn't enough to hold up in court. The stories were secondhand. The forensics were inconclusive. No direct evidence placed him at the scene. And the one person who could have tied him to it, definitively, his nephew, kept pulling back just enough to leave room for doubt. There were whispers that Richard had been seen near the Hyattsville property in the days after the abduction. That his name had surfaced more than once in internal memos. But when the final list of charges was drawn, his name wasn't on it. And then there were the others. Family members whose names floated at the edges of the case file. Cousins, in-laws, a half-brother with a sealed juvenile record. None of them spoke publicly. Some denied knowing anything. Some refused interviews outright. One, Thomas Welch, gave a single statement to the press, said he believed the girls weren't just taken by Lloyd and Richard, but by multiple members of the family. Said there was a conspiracy to hide what happened, to destroy evidence. That the silence hadn't been accidental, it had been deliberate. But by then, too many people were gone. Dead. Missing. Beyond reach. The mountain had given what it could. The basement had been cleared. And the man who finally confessed had done so in pieces, like someone throwing crumbs behind him as he disappeared into fog. No bodies were ever recovered. No graves. No headstones. The girls' remains, what little had been found, couldn't be positively identified. The fire had erased almost everything. And yet I still find myself wondering even now whether something was missed. A button. A charm. A lock of hair caught in old earth. We held a small service later that year. Just us. No press. No photos. We placed 2 wooden benches beneath the willow tree at the edge of Rock Creek Park. One for Emily.
one for Laura. There are no names carved in them, just a pair of bronze plaques, each no bigger than the palm of my hand. They read the same thing: never forgotten. Because even now, the full truth hasn't been told. And some part of me still waits for a knock for a box found in an attic, for someone to finally speak the rest aloud. 3 weeks after the hearing, we got a letter. No return address, just our name, typed in block letters, and a Bedford postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded 3 times and starting to yellow at the edges. It wasn't signed. There were no names, no threats, no confessions. Just a quiet sentence in slanted handwriting. You should have looked inside the furnace. Robert read it first. Then he passed it to me without saying a word. I sat there, staring at the line, the cheap lined paper, the smudged blue ink. And then I folded it back up and placed it in a drawer with the others. Because it wasn't the first message like that we'd gotten, and it wouldn't be the last. That fall, the cold set in early. It was the kind of season that gets into your joints before you even notice the leaves have turned. Sergeant Hamrock called again this time from his office in Hyattsville. He said a volunteer archivist at the county courthouse had been scanning old property ledgers and came across something unusual. Not new, he said, but not something they'd caught before either. There was a deed transfer from 1976, about 9 months after the girls disappeared. The document was for a small parcel of land that used to be part of a sawmill. The buyer, a shell company linked to a now-defunct carpet installation business. The seller, a relative of Richard Allen Welch. When I asked what kind of relative, Hamrock paused. His mother, he said quietly. Martha Welch. The parcel had never been developed. It sat at the far edge of an industrial zone that had long since fallen into disuse. No utilities, no paved road, just dirt and weeds and a chain-link fence half sunk in ivy. Hamrock asked if we wanted to come when they inspected it. I said yes before he finished the sentence. It was the end of October when we drove down. Gray light bare trees, the kind of wind that made everything feel older than it was. The officers who met us didn't talk much. They unlocked the fence and led us down a path of crushed gravel. At the far end, hidden behind a collapsed shed, was the old incinerator. It stood about 8 feet high, round, and rusted with a pipe that curled like a bent finger toward the sky. The kind used for burning trash before city services made it obsolete. Hamrock ran his hand along the metal, then nodded to the forensic techs behind him. They opened the top and peered inside. The first thing they found was ash. Thick layers of it undisturbed for decades. Then shards of glass. A clasp from a purse. A melted button. All unsalvageable. But further down, buried beneath the compacted soot, they found something else. Bone fragments. Tiny. Fragile. Scorched nearly white. Some were clearly animal deer, maybe. But a few were different. Human. Too small to belong to an adult. The tech said the heat had been high enough to destroy dental marker soft tissue and most marrow. But not all. It took 3 weeks to get confirmation. Mitochondrial DNA pulled from a partial bone matched a sample I'd given the year before. The lab couldn't say which girl it belonged to. There wasn't enough left. But they could say it was a child, a young girl. And that was enough. When I told Jacob, he didn't speak for a long time. He just sat with the phone pressed to his ear. Finally,
He asked if we were sure. I told him yes. Then I heard him exhale like he'd been holding it in for years. "She's gone," he said quietly. "She really is." And I understood what he meant. Because up until that moment, even with everything we'd heard, some part of me had still wondered if maybe somehow they'd made it out. That they'd been taken and hidden trafficked, renamed, erased, but still breathing somewhere far away. But now we had bone. And with it, we had finality. At least for one of them. That winter, Robert started building again. Not furniture this time, but a small box made of cherry wood. No hinges, no lining, just sanded edges and a lid that closed with a soft click. We placed the fragments inside those that were released to us and buried them near the willow in Rock Creek. No ceremony, just the sound of frost underfoot and the quiet scrape of a trowel breaking earth. I began reviewing every document we had. Case files, transcripts, old interview notes. I read the 2013 reports again, then the ones from the 1980s looking for patterns I'd missed. And one thing kept surfacing references to another man. Not Lloyd, not Richard. A third figure always unnamed, sometimes called Uncle, sometimes just him. Several of Welch's statements mentioned taking the girls to his place or saying he wanted one of them. In one transcript, when asked who gave the order, Welch replied, "It wasn't my idea." He said they were already broken. I asked Hamrock if that line had ever been followed up. He said it had years ago, but with Welch changing his story every other week, nothing could be nailed down. The older detectives had assumed he was inventing figures to shift blame, but I wasn't so sure. Something about those mentions felt too consistent, too specific to ignore. I started combing through the extended Welch family tree. There were cousins, step-uncles, people with records in 3 states. And then there was someone I hadn't seen listed before. Gregory Lynn. Not a Welch by blood, but married into the family in 1972. Divorced by 1978. No children. He'd been a drywall contractor with a small crew in Bedford County, but went off the grid in the early 80s. His last known address was listed as unverified. I sent the name to Hamrock. He called the next day. Said that name had come up once before in a 2002 tip from a former cellmate of Lloyd's who claimed Welch had bragged about someone named Greg who cleaned up after him. The tip was never substantiated, but now it didn't feel like nothing. Robert didn't want to follow it. He said we had our answer, that we had a name, a sentence, a burial. But I couldn't stop. Not with even a sliver of doubt left. Because if there was one more person out there who had a hand in what happened, someone who'd walked away while we sat for decades in silence, then I wanted his name written down too. I wanted it entered into the record, even if no court ever saw it. The last photograph we have of the girls is from Easter Sunday, 1975. They're standing on the front step in matching dresses, holding their little straw purses like they'd been practicing for church. Emily's hair is tucked behind her ears. Laura's is blowing in the wind. Behind them, the front door is wide open. You can see part of our hallway, the rug, a coat hanging on the wall. Every time I look at it now, I wonder who else looked at that photo, who else saw them as more than children, and what it took to live with that. Sometimes I imagine that third man hearing our story, watching it unfold in courtrooms, in headlines, on late-night segments that mention the case for 30 seconds and move on. I wonder if he ever turned off the volume. I wonder if he still sleeps, or if the heat of what they did reaches him in dreams the way it still does for me. I don't know what's left to find, but I know I'm still looking. We never found Gregory Lynn. Not in Maryland, not in the records of New Mexico, where someone said he'd drifted after the divorce. No recent taxes, no known children, no trace of a burial. Just a fingerprint card from 1971 and an old address that led to a demolished trailer park. The silence around him wasn't accidental. It was the kind that had been curated over time, like someone had made sure to disappear properly. Hamrock said that sometimes in cases like this, there isn't a final answer, just a narrowing of shadows. But I kept his name on the corner of my desk anyway. A name is still something. By spring, we'd put away most of the boxes. Not because we were done, God knows you're never really done, but because we were tired of circling the same orbit. Robert stopped sanding the cherry wood. The smell of sawdust faded from the house. Some mornings, I'd find him just sitting by the window, watching the same patch of sky, and I understood it. There's a kind of stillness that comes after decades of noise. You don't welcome it. You just learn how to sit beside it. We had a marker placed in Rock Creek Park. Not a headstone, just a flat piece of bronze set into the grass with 2 names and no dates. I didn't want to pick a year. I didn't want to declare a beginning or an end. I just wanted something that said, they were here, they mattered, that's all. Jacob moved back to the area later that year. He teaches now woodshop of all things. Says it helps him stay present. He visits every other week, brings groceries we don't ask for, and stays long enough to make sure we're still eating. Sometimes he talks about opening a foundation, a scholarship maybe, something in Emily and Laura's names. I told him I thought that was a good idea, and I meant it. There are still nights when I wake up and expect to hear them in the hallway bare feet, on hardwood giggles they thought we couldn't hear. But mostly it's quiet now. A deep, settled quiet that isn't about absence, but memory. There's a difference. Absence is what you feel in the first year. Memory is what settles in after the 10th. We never got a full trial. Not the kind you picture. But we got truth. Enough of it at least to name what happened and who played a part in it. I've learned that's more than most families ever get. And if there's anything I hold on to, it's that. Not revenge, not closure, just the knowledge that their story didn't vanish, that they weren't lost to some footnote. They were seen, fought for, named out loud. And maybe that's what justice looks like in real life. Not a gavel, not a confession, just the steady work of refusing to let silence win. If you've stayed with us through this story, thank you. Stories like these aren't easy to carry, but sometimes the only way forward is to share the weight. So if this one stayed with you, consider passing it on, so no name gets left behind.